Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week for our Armed with Reason podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, you might be a little bit disoriented at the moment because Devin is sitting here next to me. And typically, Devin's in Oklahoma and I'm in Connecticut. And I'm not a geography buff, but I know those places are not right next to each other. But I am excited because Devin has been here in Connecticut for, is this your sixth day now?
What is time
What
in
is time,
days?
right? Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
And before coming to Connecticut, and actually we did a trip to New York City while he was here, but before that, he was in Kentucky. So he's actually been hopping all over the place.
Which is also does not border Connecticut for
That's true.
geography
No,
buffs in
yes,
the audience.
that is legit. So we decided, since we're here together, that we might as well take a couple of minutes and maybe do a little bit of a recap as to what Devin's been up to. He's going to go into more depth on some of these topics in some writings that he's going to do for our Substack and maybe a more detailed podcast that we'll do later on. But since he's here, we're just going to talk about some of the experiences that you've had over the past almost 2 weeks since you've been on the road.
Venturing out of Oklahoma.
Yes. And for those of you who know Devin, he tends to like to be at home. So the fact that he's not only not at home, but not in Oklahoma it's like big steps for Devin. So here we are.
I'm a slight introvert. This is the first time I've actually seen people ever. So
well, not ever, but you're doing great.
Close enough.
So like I said, you're going to take some time to write a more in-depth piece about your time in Kentucky. But if you want to tell us about one of your experiences there, one of the things that you've been explaining throughout, you're talking about your travels there, one of the things that you've been explaining a lot are the nuances of going to this gun show and what signs you were met with on the doors and windows before you entered that gun show.
Yeah, so one of our excursions of several was to a gun show in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, which is quite a mouthful. And the first sign that greets you on your way into this gun show is no loaded guns. So you heard that right. The gun show was technically a gun-free zone.
If we had special sound effects and this is where all those would come in. So whatever, there's like a gasp noise or what, maybe I'll find one of those and put it in here. But yes, that's where we would insert that.
Yeah. So on one hand, I deeply appreciate that they're safety conscious there, because having a bunch of loaded guns around while checking out guns would not be the safest thing. But at the same time, the irony is somewhat overwhelming because, as you've probably heard from the pro-gun side, that like, oh, shooters and bad guys are attracted to gun-free zones. And here where you're supposed to look at and sell guns, no loaded guns are allowed, and there were no exceptions for concealed carry either. So that was quite an interesting sign to just experience on our way into the gun show.
When you were walking in, by any chance, did you see anybody who you would assume would be somebody who participated in carrying typically, who maybe was like taken aback by seeing those signs or like had to stop for a moment and go back to their car? Or did everyone sort of like walk in with a normal flow and completely uninterrupted and unfazed?
Yeah, it was basically a relatively normal flow. There's a security officer who was armed there, but nobody else could carry firearms. And from what I've heard from other places as well, in terms of some research on older gun shows, this is the norm for gun shows, is no loaded guns, which on one hand makes sense if you're in the reality-based community. But on the other hand, where the idea that gun-free zones are a target, like, should be anathema, yet here we are, sort of thing.
I have so many questions for so many people. And we're going to go more into the gun show and some more of Devin's adventures from Kentucky in a couple of weeks when we talk about a little more in depth in a podcast. So So you went from Kentucky.
Yes, I survived the gun-free zone,
Yes, you
fortunately.
did. You did survive the gun-free zone. And you flew to New York and you came here to Connecticut. And since we're not all that far from the city, we decided that we were going to host our first ever data hour, a play on happy hour.
Yes.
And
It's like happy hour, but for nerds.
right, right. That's it. It's what makes us happy. So it's fine. So we did that in the city, and there were a dozen or so folks who decided to come by for a little bit and talk to us about the work that they were doing in gun violence prevention, all really fascinating things. It never ceases to amaze me how incredible these people are in the work that they're doing day in and day out, and how creative people get. And during those conversations, we were able to talk a little bit about our data visualization, which is something that GVpedia has been working on for a long time now, and we are very excited to have it roll out this fall. We feel like it's definitely appropriate to start giving some more legitimate teasers as to what it's going to look like and how its functionality will exist. So, but what I wanted to do, Devin, is just ask you, what is one takeaway that you have from speaking with the group of individuals there in DC at our first data hour?
Yeah, so just being in the city and being able to meet all these people in person who, like, you've heard their name before, or even like there's an email associated, but just being able to gather in person has a whole nother kind of meaning behind it, where it's like, oh, it's not just like a robot randomly typing out emails, but like actual people who have been doing this work in some cases for decades upon decades.
Yeah.
And really important work that some people might have never heard of before, but is absolutely essential. Like, we were talking with a scientist who's currently conducting studies using neuroimaging to look at the impact of gun violence on the brain and seeing what sort of impact there is, trying to develop a scale. And so we hope to have her on the podcast relatively soon to talk about that sort of exciting work. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, as it were, in terms of all the efforts that are going on a daily basis that oftentimes we don't hear about and the light's not shed on. And it's really important to shed that light and to give attention to all these important efforts.
Absolutely.
So what were some of your takeaways or top one?
My top takeaway would have to be sort of to echo what you said about seeing these people that we interact with a lot over social media or over Zoom or email or text message, whatever it might be. Obviously, it's fantastic that we can stay in touch in all these different ways, and through COVID in particular, these things were super important to us. But I think in some ways it's easy to forget, unless you're living it in real time, how critical it is to actually meet in person. And it was so fascinating to participate in these conversations, but also to take a step back and watch the sparks fly between people and their creativity start to flow. You know, you're working on this and I'm working on this, and maybe we could collaborate on this. And that's where the power of a real movement, gun violence prevention related or otherwise, really takes its truest form. And so to be able to facilitate that in a really casual setting, right? We're at a bar in New York City, this place called One Star Bar.
It has more than 1 star on Google.
It does. It's like 4.4 stars on Google. But with like $6 beers, by the way. So if you need a space to go hang out in the city, plug for One Star Bar. Between
not a sponsor,
right? Not sponsor. Between 6th and 7th on 24th. It was a moment of pride for me when we facilitated that space for those conversations to happen. And we in the movement take opportunities to get together, I think, at really large events, at certain conferences, in advocacy work in Washington, D.C. for press conferences, which is fantastic, of course. But these like smaller groups and the opportunity to really get to know one another and to say, you know, this is what's important to me in my organization, what's important to you in your organization. Those are just things that are a lot harder to do virtually. So we're from all over the country, and we have some of us are, advocates that have 9 to 5 jobs and things other than gun violence prevention. And some of us are spending all of our time in this, and we have survivors who have made it their life's work to make the country a safer place. But my takeaway was just we really can't lose sight of the value of us being together in the same space for the ability to really allow the movement to continue to grow and to make progress.
Well, also just the diversity of backgrounds that gun violence for unfortunately, but brings all these people together who typically might never interact with each other, yet here we all are in the same space working towards the common goal of ending gun violence, recognizing that it will take decades to achieve that goal, but realizing that's what's needed.
Right. It's a really terrible form of job security.
Yeah, it's one of those problems that's not going to be going away anytime soon, unfortunately, but it means that there's a lot more work that still needs to be done.
Right, absolutely. So one thing that we want to let everybody know is the data visualization. As soon as we have some more ways to share that with you, we will get that out there as soon as we can, but we'll also do a podcast about that. And you probably will get sick of hearing it once it's finally launched. So if you've heard us mention that in this and you're like, what's the data visualization? Don't worry, we will have lots more details about that.
Over the next couple months, you will know what the data visualization is.
Yes, absolutely. So once the data visualization comes out, we're hoping that our listeners will be the ones who will try it out for us. Let us know if any bugs pop up, which we're hoping there aren't many, but it's inevitable that there'll be one or two. So we know that those of you who are listening here or watching here are our biggest fans and supporters. So we're thank you in advance for anything that you do with that.
Yeah, if you're not watching on YouTube, just envision like an Uncle Sam, but me saying GVpedia needs you to check out the data visualization. Yes. And yeah, we're really excited about the future progress of this. This has been a long time in the works, and it's finally coming about. And what you'll be seeing in the next 2 to 3 weeks is going to be just the first step in this data visualization project that will hopefully incorporate all of GVpedia going forward. And so it won't be just the first one-time thing. This year, over the coming years, we plan on expanding it much more and integrating everything to where it's as useful a tool as we can possibly create. And we're excited for those next few years to see what we can help create, and also for your feedback to where we can make it as useful as possible for you. So we need you to then eventually help you in some circular fashion.
Yes, yes. So now it's the end of the week. Devin, you head home tomorrow.
Yes. Thankfully, there's a direct flight.
By the time this is up, Devin will already be home, safe and sound. Yes. But yeah, that's it for your adventures that you've had this fall locally. And I know it's been great to be able to be with you again in the same space. Devin and I only get to see each other typically in Washington, D.C. when we go down before the holidays for the CAP conference that happens down there. So
we're doubling our in-person interactions per year here.
We are. And thanks for being so good. I'm a mom, and I appreciate that Devin was so good to hang out with my family and my daughter and play some games, and we went for ice cream. And so I don't know, I just appreciate that. But that's what the movement helps you find, right? Is people that you can vibe with, and
lots and lots of ice cream.
Lots and lots of ice cream. All right. Well, I'm going to let Devin go so we can finish our last bit of work here in Connecticut, and then he can get packing and ready to head home. But thank you for listening to the podcast, and we will have a guest on our episode next week. And yeah, that's it. Any final thoughts, Devin?
Well, just see all of you next week.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.